everyone to the panel AI for Biodiversity and Food Systems. This panel is part of the AI for Biodiversity track of the 2021 AI for Climate Global Forum. My name is Constanza Gomez-Mont, co-founder of the AI for Climate Initiative, and it is a great pleasure to be here with you for this conversation. I would like to welcome our special guests, Dr. Jyotsna Puri and Dr. Máximo Torero, two renowned experts that will help us better understand the role of leveraging new technologies to promote food security, preserve crops diversity, and adapt to a changing climate and a growing population. We're profoundly honored to have this important conversation today. We're living at a time where climate change is putting food production at risk. We're already seeing crops yields declining in various parts of the world due to extreme weather. And actually, it is estimated that in the absence of effective adaptation, global yields could decline by up to 30% by 2050, increasing social and environmental vulnerability worldwide. However, the use of new technologies like AI systems can serve as strategic tools to help us with the resiliency of food systems and can assist us to create models for future potential climate scenarios and take action. These are topics that Dr. Joe and Dr. Máximo and our great interviewer, Lucia Troches, will discuss today. So let me start by sharing with you more about our special guests. Dr. Jyotsna Puri is the Associate Vice President of the Strategy and Knowledge Department at the International Fund for Agricultural Development. She leads the organization's strategy work in IFAD's key areas, targeting agriculture, climate, gender, nutrition, youth, and social inclusion, providing the vision for evidence-informed advice on program designs and implementation. She's also an adjunct associate professor at Columbia University, where she has also been a research scientist. She has published in various academic journals, written for newspapers, and provided advice as a board member to several development organizations. Moreover, Dr. Máximo Torero is a chief economist of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Prior to joining FAO, he was a World Bank Group Executive Director for Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Paraguay, Peru, and Uruguay since November 2016. Before the bank, Dr. Torero led the division of the markets, trade, and institutions at the International Food Policy Research Institute. His major research work lies mostly in analyzing poverty, inequality, importance of geography and assets, in explaining poverty, and in policy oriented towards poverty alleviation based on the role played by infrastructure, institutions, and how technological breakthroughs can improve the welfare of households and small farmers. And last but not least, our interviewer for today's session, Lucia Troches. Lucia is an engineer that has over 12 years of experience in the technology and entrepreneurship sector. She focuses on designing and implementing multi-sectoral strategies to help companies, organizations, and governments. As director of programs at Siemens and our amazing director of the AI for Climate Global Forum, Lucia works with the public and private sectors in the creation and implementation of projects ranging from the environmental sector to the AI field. Prior to Siemens, she was the international marketing manager for Techstars, leading global initiatives that impacted over 10,000 entrepreneurs. Dr. Joe, Dr. Máximo, and Lucia, thank you for joining us. And Lucia, the microphone is all yours to lead this conversation.
Thank you so much, Constanza. And it's such a pleasure to be here with you, Dr. Joe, Dr. Máximo. I would like to start the conversation asking Joe, if I can call you that, if that's okay.
Sure.
Joe, how can we ensure the prosperity of food systems, the environment, biodiversity, and ecosystems throughout the life cycle of AI systems?
So I think we've got to go back first to think about, well, what do AI systems represent, right? I mean, we are today in a space where we have a lot of data, but we have a lot of technology that can help us to think far more efficiently, far faster, but also qualitatively in different ways. I'm only going to reveal my age when I say that when I started off as a research scientist at the Earth Institute, we used to collect data on paper forms, and it used to take approximately a couple of years to clean data and to essentially do analysis on across Africa for millions of data points. Of course, the generation that is watching this today, inshallah, thinks that that's a completely foreign concept. So the first idea is really in recognizing that this is changing the way we are thinking and therefore using data and really is a paradigm shift from this time and space where data was considered a scarcity, and almost all of our economic and econometric and decision models used to be predicated on scarce data. We have now shifted the paradigm to thinking about big data, lots of data, rapid data in real time. And that's what AI and technologies associated with it can help us to do, is to think about our futures in a far different way. But as we think about this, so, as we think about agriculture, as we think about nutrition, and as we think about biodiversity, I think the key thing is in recognizing that we can target better. So I'm going to use a couple of examples then to say that we can target better using the same instruments that we had previously. For example, so in a lot of the investments that IFAD is making, so the institution that I belong to now, we have multi-layered, high-resolution GIS data and satellite data. But satellite data, as you know, requires interpretation as well. And again, a large part of this interpretation is now made possible because we have, trained algorithms that have looked at these areas and have trained themselves on those areas to then far more accurately interpret as to what's happening on the ground, and we are using that to then understand what should be the areas with different geographic, socioeconomic attributes where we can target better, because IFAD works in areas that are high rural poverty. And it is also in the agriculture sector really in wanting to ensure that we get high value for money. But high value for money means we've got to have low costs and high impact. And that requires that you have to be very precise with your data as well. And so precision agriculture is where we play a very important role. Whether it's thinking about what are the solutions, what are the types of crops, what are the cropping patterns that are most suitable, or it's thinking about, well, what are the populations that we want to target and how AI can really help us to, and has been helping us already, to think about these in far more intelligent ways. One more example. Blockchain technologies. One of the key concerns that I personally have every time I go to, for example, COP, and I went to COP 26, was that we are in the era of big commitments. Everyone wants to come forward and say, well, we'll do this by 2030 and this by 2040 and this by 2050. They also like to say that, yes, we'll get X number of dollars to our overall target beneficiaries. Guess what? All of this can be proven now. We know exactly what the financial flows are, who they are going to, which dollar is going to whom, and blockchain technology can help us to think through that and to see that on the ground. So IFAD, for example, is experimenting and has used some of our programs, so the Adaptation for Smallholder Farmers program, to then experiment and see as to how we can pilot some of these technologies to also understand financial flows and be far more credible in what we are doing on the ground, and also going back and mitigating what might be called impact washing in other institutions or in other parts of the world. I'm going to stop here and hand it back to you, Lucia.
Thank you, Dr. Jo. And I think that something that you mentioned that's key here is that now we have a lot of data that is available, but we need to ensure that this data can be used again for that impact, right? And I would like to ask you, Maximo, if that's okay as well, how could we effectively govern agricultural technologies and innovation that change at such a fast pace to make sure that these technological advances do not exacerbate the inequalities that could be happening in the primary sector so far?
Thank you very much. A pleasure to be here. I think it's important to understand that technologies are a tool that help us to achieve certain goals. And clearly, in the case of agriculture, especially for the excluded or the smallholder farmers, the idea is how we can increase the efficiency in which use this information to help them to be able to achieve and to increase the productivity. As you mentioned before, because of the population growth and because the space that is being restricted for land in the future and land that is of good quality as well of access of water, these farmers will be facing significant challenges, and we need to give them as precise and as fast and usable information they can have to be able to make the better decisions. Now, as it can help them to increase their productivity and as it can help them to resolve some problems and to, for example, bring precision agriculture to smallholders, which is a big challenge, because today precision agriculture is economies of scale, not neutral. So it's not neutral, which means that you need bigger scale to be able to use it. But it seems to me that it's something that can become scale neutral, and therefore is something that will be optimal for smallholders because they have very little resources. And the more we can help them to make the use of the resources in the most efficient way, will create the success that we're looking for. But these technologies have constraints and have barriers of entries. You sometimes need certain levels of investment to be able to have access to these technologies. Any artificial intelligence, any type of digital technologies will require access to electricity in certain form, will require access to the equipment, to the broadband to be able to use them optimal, will require that level of capability or knowledge on how to use this type of technology. Sometimes language could be even a barrier. Most of the agricultural sector are rural people which are not necessarily were educated, and therefore they don't know how to read and write. So that by itself could be a barrier. And also, of course, outside of the cost of accessibility, as I mentioned before, there is the issue of the content. Many cases, the content is developed for other realities and not for the realities that these farmers are facing. And this goes from the very basic primitive technologies that we have in the digital world, which was the use of price information systems. Most of the price information systems were not designed for the needs of the small farmers. They were designed for people that were selling in the wholesale market, which not necessarily was the case of the small farmers. So with all these dimensionalities, we need to find ways in which we avoid that deploying these technologies will create more exclusion. We don't want smallholders not to be able to access to broadband. We don't want the smallholders that have access to broadband that won't be able to use it because they won't have the capabilities to use it. And we don't want the content not to be adapted to the reality. And that's where we need to bring institutionality, and that's where we need to bring other ways of doing things and thinking out of the box. So the third thing for that is what we call in FAO the complements. And the complements combine several things, combine institutions, human capability, and governance. One of the things that we are doing, for example, to accelerate the South-South learning and to accelerate the process of leapfrogging is to bring the International Platform for Digital Food and Agriculture, which is exactly trying to bring what we have learned from other countries in the South so that other countries in the South can use it and can adapt it to the reality, trying to avoid going through processes and failures that others has gone through. So that's what we call leapfrogging on the technology. Second, clearly in the developing country, we need to bring support into the institutional development. Regulation will be important. It is essential to avoid that new monopolies are being formed in the deployment of these type of technologies, which are mostly based on digital technologies. So we need to be very good at developing and helping developing countries to have the regulatory mechanisms in place. Another issue which is central, especially in artificial intelligence, is the issue of ethics. And we are part of the first agreement on the Rome Call for Artificial Intelligence Ethics, which is supported by Pope Francis and which was signed at the Vatican together with Microsoft and IBM. And the idea here is that we are trying to bring in the use of artificial intelligence transparency. Artificial intelligence systems must be explainable. Inclusion, the needs of all human beings must be taken into consideration so that everyone can benefit and all individuals can be offered the best possible conditions to express themselves and develop. Responsibility, those who design and deploy the use of AI must proceed with responsibility and transparency. Impartiality, so do not create or act according to bias, thus safeguarding fairness and human dignity. Reliability, AI systems must be able to work with reliability. And security and privacy. AI systems must work securely and respect the privacy of users. This, we believe, is central to be able to achieve an inclusive mechanism of artificial intelligence, and also is central to understand that these are disruptive technologies. and we shouldn't expect them necessarily to resolve all the problems we face. They will work if we use them in complement with others, and they will work if we have the complements in place to make them accessible to all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Máximo. And I think that what you mentioned is key, right? To ensure that we are using artificial intelligence in an ethical and responsible way, alongside other programs that can fulfill that role of making sure that communities and small farmers are also being capacitated into using these systems, right? Making sure that they have all of the tools to be using them. And going back a little bit to you, Joe, do you have any thoughts on how we could analyze or predict specifically like how an agricultural technology could increase those inequalities or could have a negative impact in the primary sector?
Did you mean artificial intelligence or just technologies?
I think in general technologies, but if you want to go in depth in artificial intelligence, that's also good.
Yeah, for sure. And, just to build on, I think some of the comments that Maximo made as well. I think we all read about how we are training our algorithms on data, which by itself has not been tried and tested for reflecting or representing the sorts of values that we want to bring forward, right? And so whether we are talking about marginalized populations, and I'm going to be politically correct here, but I think we all read about some of the way that algorithms, even on say Facebook or all of the other platforms that we use, will ignore or translate or interpret certain data and in a certain way because our trial data sets are skewed in certain ways, right? And so I think it becomes really important that we be aware, like the 12-step process for Alcoholics Anonymous. I think the first step is acceptance, and really accepting that, yes, these are possible pitfalls that we can have with all technologies that we use, and then trying to see as to how we might redress or mitigate them. And especially for populations, and these are populations that EPAD works with, so the rural poor, traditionally the more marginalized, the women, the indigenous people, farmers groups, etc. These tend to be ignored both with respect to the data that has been collected, but therefore the solutions that are built on these and are built traditionally with data collection are very different from what would apply to the rural spaces that we work in, right? So that's one. And I think really recognizing the pitfalls of, and recognizing and admitting that we've got to have training data and acknowledge that in the data that we are training our algorithms on, we need to reflect exactly the sets of values that we want to have as we go forward. And so making sure that those are future fit for our values is very key, right? I think the second thing that I am keen to also see is that obviously, data systems and any sorts of technologies are value free. And unfortunately, value free does not mean valueless, because they end up inadvertently also multiplying any omission that we have made. Right. And so as we think about solutions, so for example, climate modeling. So we do, for example, a lot of the vulnerability assessments in a lot of our vulnerability assessments with a lot of the investments that we are doing, and those are required. And so it does require that we are collecting high quality real-time data on the populations that we are targeting, but then also thinking about how we might mitigate risks. And for a lot of this risk mitigation, we have to then think of different, say, scenarios. In modeling, that is required. But guess what? When you are using models, I think what people end up forgetting is that the way you parameterize these models, that is, the values that you give to them as part of the overall base, are also coming from data. that unfortunately are building on inequity or values that we may not treasure, we may not want to multiply. And so really being very aware that unless we are very careful, these inequities and these transitions might multiply or and exponentially in many cases, some of the inequities that we have seen is really key. I think the one other point that I want to make is that, and for a lot of our data is unfortunately, so if you look at pricing data, for example, right? Pricing data doesn't bring in, and this is a pretty well-known idea, pricing data doesn't bring in the things that we really care about, right? So the value, the amenity value of the environment, the amenity value of keeping, 100-year-old forests standing, etc. So really, as we think about solutions as well, I think it becomes very important for us to examine and re-examine as to what these might be urging us to do in terms of actions, and really ensuring that we are representing our values in there.
Thank you so much. And just like another question that is connected specifically to that, because you're talking about like that takes as well resources and money, and making sure that we have a specific plan in place to make sure that we are mitigating those risks and making sure that we are involving those communities. But how can we ensure the participation of local and indigenous communities? And how can we also ensure that the developing countries not only adopt them, but also get developed enough to make sure that they're not only consuming them from the developed countries, but also developing their own technologies?
So let me take the first question first. Is that for me or for Máximo?
I think it's, I would like to make our conversation. So if you want to respond, because I did think about it when you were talking about it, and then Máximo can complement.
Yeah. So actually, let me take the second question first. I think we tend to think that developing countries don't have a lot of these technologies. Actually, that's incorrect. I come from India, and I know, for example, that India and many of the developing countries that I've had the opportunity to also work in and work with represent very high levels of use of the kind of technology that we want to see, and we are able to harness this. So I think this is I'm going to say it's an urban myth that developing countries don't have access to these technologies and don't have access to the kind of data that we are thinking about. But I think, sorry, can you cue me on the first part of your question, Lucia?
So how can we ensure the participation of local and indigenous communities?
So thanks for that. So, for example, the ICT4D strategy that we have with an EFAD, right? So what we ensure also is that we are able to share a lot of the data as well as the interpretation with people on the ground, which then has actually a two-way benefit. One, it also helps to take people along on the journey, but it also helps us ground truth. A lot of the interpretations that we may be attaching to the data inadvertently in many cases, but helps us to understand not just the data, but also the why of the data. And I think this is also key. We are learning this from data very quickly as well, that it's not just important to understand the how much or what, it's also why and how. And the why and how really is something that I think there is no substitute for really being on the ground and being able to ground truth it, and to ensure that there is participation by the people who are affected in it. And this gets reflected in a lot of the strategies that we use at EFAD as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. Máximo, if you want to also answer that question about ensuring that developing countries and communities are involved on it.
No, sure. So it would be unrealistic to think that there is not a digital gap. Clearly, there is a digital gap in the world, and it's a big gap. And the more rural we are, or the more minority we are, the bigger the gap it is, because it's standard. There is less investment, therefore higher access and higher cost of access to these technologies. But despite of this, the technology will be inclusive if we help to minimize those barriers, as I mentioned before, but especially if it is what they really need and it is resolving the problem that they are facing. The problem in many cases is that these technologies are provided and they are not responding to the needs of indigenous people or to the needs of smallholder farmers and so on and so forth. So it's not just having access, it's making it useful. If it is useful, then they will figure out a way in which they will have access to it. The most simple example in digital world is that the ones who pay the highest price for a minute of phone is the prepaid phone calls. So the prepaid phone calls are the most expensive, more expensive than any of the phones that you have in your house and that I have. So that means that people are finding ways in which they can use their little resources to have access because they value what they can get through that phone. Now, scale this up to other types of things. So using technologies or artificial intelligence or big data to be able to identify, for example, how to resolve a problem I have in my farm. No, what this technology does, it helps me to minimize the cost of delivering that. So if I look into health issues of plants, the ways we are doing it right now is I can take as a farmer a picture in my digital phone, in my cellular phone, and send that picture of the disease to the cloud, and then automatically there will be a system behind that will analyze that picture and will bring me a set of different solutions. Now, what happens if the solution is to use pesticide H, and where I am, pesticide H doesn't exist? Then for the farmer, it's useless. No? He invested a little money to have the prepaid phone, digital phone that he needs to be able to send the picture, but results like the solution of that pesticide H doesn't exist. And that's where we need to figure out how we develop the plethora of solutions that they can use. Some of those could be feasible for them in the environment they are working on. And that's where we need to find a solution. The other problem, and that also eliminates the barriers, and we have tested this, for example, given that the level of illiteracy that we have in rural areas and the aging population that we have in the farming, especially in developing countries, sometimes it's better to use a mean of translation, a mean of communication. And the best mean we have found is children, kids in the school. And this is not child labor, it's on the opposite. It's basically providing knowledge to kids that they can transfer to their parents. Because the kids can transform this information, which sometimes is difficult for the parents because they never have been in a school, and use them as a way to translate the information to the parents. So for example, if we find that a household has a fall armyworm disease in the maize they produce, we can provide solutions to the kids like a molasses trap, very simple solutions, low-cost solutions. They can immediately transfer that information to the parents, and the parents can use them. Or the yellow traps, for example, no? That also helps to minimize the presence of certain pests and diseases. So these simple ways of doing things, but doing things of good quality and with significant sophistication could be behind the scenes through artificial intelligence, through blockchains and so on, could be extremely useful. No? Other elements are what we do now in blockchain for food safety, for example. No? How we can scale that, how we can provide that information so that farmers understand. If they want to go to the market, for example, and sell their maize, they know that their maize without aflatoxins will be receiving a price premium. It's important because if they are going to make an investment to dry their maize to be able to sell in the local market, they better get something in return relative to the other farmer who didn't do it. But sometimes that information doesn't exist, and the farmer will go to the market that not necessarily pays for that, while he can walk 50 minutes more or 20 minutes more and go to a market where, for some reason, WFP is connected, for example, and is buying high standards, which is aflatoxin-free maize, and is being tested, and they will get a price premium. So again, we have to find ways in which we provide information that is useful for them, and then they will find the ways also in which they can have access to that information. But of course, we need to understand that there is a digital gap, and we need to find ways to work with governments so that they resolve especially the access and the cost of access digital gap, because today it's cheaper for governments to deploy fiber optics and then, for example, giving concession the last mile so that farmers can have access, and rural people especially, at a lower cost.
And I think what you mentioned is super important because in the end, there are so many countries where the farmers and the small farmers, it's a family business, right? So children probably are going to be the ones following their parents' footsteps. So if they have the information, they can as well implement that technology. And I see it all the time here. I live in Jalisco in Mexico. And I think that's happening as well here. And then another question that I have for both of you is, what are the actions that could lead member states to move towards the development of ethical and inclusive AI systems that promote compliance with SDGs as well? I think that, for example, talking about SDG regarding no poverty or zero hunger are important for that specific sector. So what do you think that those actions could be? Joe, we can start with you.
So I want to take off from where the previous commentary left off, right? I think it's important to acknowledge that there is a digital gap, and this speaks to your question, Lucia, but I think much more usefully, in a non-trivial way, that digital gap is far more useful to think about in terms of access by income classes rather than by countries. We've seen far more innovative uses of technology, AI, etc., in countries that are traditionally characterized as low or low middle income countries than, I have to confess, in many other, more developed or advanced countries that I've worked and lived in. And I think that what is really important is to see that as an access problem and a use problem, and then to really make the argument for a greater return to investment. And that's what I would really work with member states to then see whether it is precision agriculture, whether it is just more credibility for the kind of resources that we are spending on the ground and the extent to which we are able to galvanize resources. These are member state contributions, and to be able to see and to track and trace that is, we have now the ability to do that with technology, right? We are also able to target far better, and I think this is this is one of the key things that I hold very dear with respect to how IFAD is working, that we are able to target far more precisely and to be able to use that technology to get the biggest bang for our buck. One more area that I think can also two more areas that I think we can use to think about galvanizing member states is one in just also evidence and meta-analysis of the evidence that we are collecting. We're able to use artificial search algorithms to then do far more quickly, say evidence maps and or systematic reviews and or meta-analysis, and also know what works, what doesn't, for whom, why, and how much. Earlier it used to take 2.5 years or 3 years to do that kind of work because most of your time was spent searching databases. And now you can do that with algorithms really in like 3 months. And that's after tagging and then also creating the right kind of algorithms, etc. And that time can be spent far more effectively, and we can now curate knowledge in far better ways. I think my last point is really in the context of climate. How can we get member states far more excited and galvanized rather than, of course, value for money and better targeting and better evidence? Is also in the context of climate. Think about carbon markets. Carbon markets are really telling us that, yes, we want to reduce our overall greenhouse gas emissions. We can now, with the technology that we have available, look at the sequestration capabilities of soil. We can track and trace and set that up for MRBs, for forests. We can also understand the extent to which oceans are really acting as sinks and how much of this is being, how much of our oceans are really acting as sinks and how efficiently. All of this is now possible with the technologies that we have available, and can give us, well, not just the twinkle that was in all of our eyes that yes, we need to be far more credible in terms of thinking about carbon markets, but be far more precise and far more targeted in what we can do with the agriculture sector. And that's where, it's still, COP26 talked about Article 6, which is where we are still talking about voluntary markets. But I think it's really important that with the use of these technologies, we can now go into far greater standardization and use of these markets, especially if we're going to hold our climate change goals and our net zero goals close to our hearts. So I would take all of those arguments to our member states.
Thank you so much, because that sounds amazing. And I think that actions have to be very specific, and I think that you're very specific in the way that you're talking about them. Maximo, do you want to complement as well? What other actions can you think could be?
I don't think that I need to bring too many arguments to the member states. The first thing they want is to have policies in place of property rights, of data privacy, and so on and so forth. The issue is how we implement them, and the issue how we're doing in a way which really is beneficial for the smallholders. So sometimes it sounds contradictory, Our job is to provide information to the most excluded or to the poorest farmers, and we are the ones being asked to put in place policies of data privacy and transparency. When most of the problems of data privacy and transparency doesn't come from us, it comes from other areas, which comes from developed countries. But again, it's really important to do it because it will help us also to avoid exclusion, which is one of the issues that we want to avoid. Through the call for ethics, it helps us to increase transparency. It helps us to bring responsibility, as I mentioned before, and reliability of the information we do, and security and privacy. So I found it as a good request because if it is applied symmetrically across the board, it's what we need to do. And that's what should happen. Today, big companies and the biotechnology companies, for example, they have enormous opportunity to get and collect information of what is being done in the field. They have sensors today that they can measure exactly how much emissions are coming out from the field. They know exactly how biotech and biotech innovative seeds are increasing yields, how much water they are using. They have all that information. So that information should be reliable, should be public, should be accessible to the owner of that information, and he should have the right. So let's create this ethics, but ethics across the board, and not for specific groups of people. That for me is central. Now, what it means also, it means that there is a lot of new things that we can do, and it will have a lot of benefits to farmers. But let me repeat again, I don't think these technologies are the panacea. They are good for what they are. They don't resolve everything. And yes, I agree with Joe. We can use text scrapping to assess 3,000 papers in 1 week or in 1 day, depending on how good my machine learning is and how good my dictionary of words that I'm searching is. But when you start looking at the papers, still we have a lot of challenges on how to get the good quality papers. We did this for food losses, for example. We started with a database of 5,000 papers being selected by a significant machine learning system. And when we started looking in detail to the information that was being provided, it was not as good as we thought it was, okay? Of course, you can keep improving the test scrapping procedures, and you can keep feeding with better procedures behind. But again, as she says, it's a huge gain in terms of having a massive amount of information. But my only point is, let's be careful also, and let's keep improving this knowledge so that we can do this properly. I have another example, which for me is an amazing example. In FAO, we have 12 early warning systems. Each one worked independently to each other, which is something that we're trying to fix. But in each early warning system, we have a person that has been working there for close to 30 years, looking at this information and basically defining when there was a problem of price, when a quota on a wheat commodity for a big exporting country could be implemented. And they have enormous amount of experience for the last 30 years. And every month they produce a report where they indicate and they bring golden knowledge on their assessment. Now, today, we can do the same. But if I don't have the brain of that person in my artificial intelligence system, I won't be able to get all these triggers that he has learned with so much time. So our job right now is to basically learn from him, validate my system, and basically copy his brain as much as I can within the ethical procedure so that we can have this person to be able to help me to trigger, because at some point this person will be retiring. Okay, and all his knowledge will be moved out, and happily for him, but sadly for all of us that we need the early warning systems that they are developing. So again, we need to keep learning, we need to keep bringing this system into place to be able to keep improving what we do. But it's not a panacea. Let's not believe that this will solve everything, because it has not in the past and it will not in the future.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. From the AI for Climate team, I think I can speak from the founders as well, and from us. We also say that it shouldn't be used just because it's technology, right? If it's not the right tool to solve a problem, it shouldn't be used for that. So I agree completely with you. And to close up the panel and to wrap up, I would like to thank you both for so much information. And I think that so many insights on how we can better use this technology in an ethical and responsible way, how we can make sure that all of the people that are included in that could be included in the process have this very specific actions. And again, just pointing to some things, right? Like what the access to that information is, access to the technology, and how we could create those actions to ensure that the data points that are being used are not only being used because it's data, but it's because it's useful data to ensure that the systems can be the best that they can for the problems that they're trying to solve in this sector. So thank you so much. I would like to pass the microphone back to Constanza. And yes, Cons, go ahead.
Thank you both for your key perspectives. We know that the use of AI systems, indeed, and other technologies as tools to increase food security and improve the lives of farmers is a very nascent field, and there is still a long path to untap all of its potential. We agree that it is not only a matter of how and when, but the why we are deciding on the use is key and profoundly important. And also, as both of our guests said, there are various risks in matters of inclusion, local context and needs, knowledge and access, and the quality and representative data, among many other considerations that have to be prevented and managed correctly to ensure that indeed these tools are used to accelerate inclusive and responsible action and not necessarily broaden existing inequalities, especially in a field where so many vulnerabilities can be present. As Dr. Joe said, we're living in a paradigm shift, and that needs the right complements to make the best out of it, as Dr. Máximo shared. In the AI for Climate initiative, we are enthusiastic about these opportunities in this field, and we will be looking forward to learning more about the work of IFAD and FAO in this. Thank you so much. And to those who are watching, stay with us for our next presentation of the AI for Climate Global Forum.
Thank you so much, Constanza and Lucia. Really such a pleasure for me to be here. Thanks, Maximo. Good to see you.
Thank you to all. It was great to be here. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Constanza. Thank you, Lucia.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.